Aristotle's Theory of Dynamics, Examining the Ancient Greek Roots of Process Philosophy, by John Robert Bagby, Supervisor John Salas. Abstract. Henri Bergson's interpretation of Aristotle has not been adequately considered in scholarship. Bergson was greatly inspired by Aristotle's method and discoveries in psychology and metaphysics, but Bergson also accused Aristotle of having reduced philosophy to an analysis of language. Beneath the apparent rigid formalism of Aristotelian logic, he had in fact described life in a dynamic and qualitatively rich way that is consonant with Bergson's qualitative multiplicity. I show the commonalities between their philosophies and suggest ways of interpreting Aristotle from a Bergsonian perspective. In tracking all Bergson's discussions of Aristotle, some very critical and reductive, others quite favorable and generous, it becomes evident that Aristotle's dynamic sense of being describes qualitative multiplicity. This becomes clear when we examine the interrelated problems of movement, force, life, intuition, the soul, embodiment, time, ethics, and art. The theory of dynamics, or the dynamic sense of being, is the underlying thread which weaves these topics together in both Aristotelianism and Bergsonism. This dissertation demonstrates how effort and energy, constituting a hylomorphic unity of experience, provides phenomenological evidence grounding the theory of dynamics. The work of Bergson's mentor, Félix Ravissant, is decisive in this historical reconstruction. Ravissant's dynamic interpretation highlights Aristotle's own critique of logical formalism and presents an intuitive knowledge of life which is inexpressible in language. Bergson clearly borrows insights from Ravissant's interpretation, but also discredits the validity of them. The burgeoning field of phenomenological interpretations of Aristotle contribute to the dynamic interpretation. I use this scholarship to refute aspects of Bergson's logical interpretation. In sum, I show that Aristotle's theory of dynamics is the central paradigm for his whole philosophy, tying together his physics, biology, psychology, epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. Bergson built further upon dynamics, evolving it endogenously, in order to create his qualitative multiplicity, flowing of duration, and élan vital. After critiquing the logical interpretations of Aristotle for their reliance on a metaphysics of presence, it becomes clear Aristotle had already described intensity, continuity, sympathy, and developmental progression as qualitative multiplicity along the lines of Bergson. Prelude on the Aristotelian roots of Bergsonism. The primary claim of this work is that Bergson found inspiration for his coined phrase, qualitative or continuous heterogeneous multiplicity, from an interpretation of Aristotle's dynamic sense of hylomorphism. Qualitative multiplicity describes time, or rather duration, as a mode of being that is irreducible to quantities or concepts, and inexpressible in language. What this exposition makes clear is how Aristotle's theory of dynamics is much more than a study of movement as a sector of reality. It is instead a fundamental mode of being which profoundly informs the orientation of his psychology, epistemology, ontology, ethics, and aesthetics. By examining Bergson's interpretation of Aristotle, it becomes evident that in order to properly appreciate Aristotle's dynamic sense of being, we must take it to denote qualitative multiplicity. This connection has not generally been recognized for several reasons. Firstly, Bergson covered it up in Creative Evolution by giving a straw man caricature of Aristotle which downplayed the dynamic and energetic aspects of his thought. Secondly, Bergson's aforementioned reading is in many respects a standard reading. Scholarship on Aristotle to this day suffers from the habits of over-intellectualizing, fixing concepts, emphasizing generality, or translating arguments symbolically. Obscurities and inconsistencies abound when we fail to appreciate the repugnance of phusis, psyche, or nous to being rendered in a single clear and distinct formula or as concepts. The formidable edifice of Aristotelian logic itself seems to require that we reduce being to the presence of symbols to intellectual vision. The ambiguity and complexity of pre-Socratic logos is thought by many to have been definitively reduced and neutralized into an abstract linguistic relation by Aristotle. For this reason, Aristotle has been considered the starting point of a metaphysics of presence, which has come to dominate Western thought and science. And so he has been taken as the point of departure for a critique and deconstruction of presence in the history of philosophy. But real continuity, which I show is at the heart of Aristotle's dynamic sense of being, is in fact unable to be jammed into the scaffolding of symbolic logic. The artificial obscurity which accompanies such verbal and conceptual interpretations has been slowly dissipating over the past few decades, in large part due to the growing number of phenomenological interpretations. A dynamic, process, and embodied sense of logos is being restored which disrupts the standard logical verbal interpretation. See Eugen 2017, Viega 2019. There is a sort of concrete logos of dynamics which upends and the supposed static and closed system of doctrines and concepts which has been codified into the edifice of Aristotelian philosophy. Beneath the superficial crust of Aristotelian formalism is an energetic depth which vibrates, dances, and sings of the concrete ambiguity and duration of life. Interpretations bringing Aristotle's dynamic sense of being to life can be felt in commentaries such as Plotinus, Ibn Bajjah, Suarez, Leibniz, Ravison, Brentano, Heidegger, Derrida, Eubank, Foti, Weiland, Kosman, Sachs, Baraki, Vigo, Brogan, Jimenez, Schumacher, de Ribera Martin, Bianchi, Trott, and Santesi. Despite these efforts, the logical interpretations still dominate. Bergson himself expounded such an interpretation in Creative Evolution. They are alike in neglecting, ignoring, erasing, or neutralizing the dynamic sense of being. Aristotle's dynamics is not an objective system of concepts that we stand external to, but requires both experience and a genuine effort on the part of the interpreter. The living quality of effort itself serves as the principle on which philosophy depends. I mean that the dynamic sense of being is made manifest in the lived effort and energy of our own inner sense as immediately felt. On this point, Bergsonism is most obviously an insuration of dynamism following Aristotle's intimations of effort and energy. The dynamism of the soul's concrete hylomorphic energy serves as the primary basis on which dynamics as a whole is made intelligible. We must no longer overlook this obscure but profound fact of intellectual history. Aristotle was not only a thinker of infinity, continuity, and multiplicity, but is responsible for first formulating a concept of the infinitely small, what we would later call differentials and fluxions, and a simple unity connecting an infinite multiplicity of fluctuations, an integral. This is to say, and without having adequately qualified this formula, which will seem either too modest or too ambitious, Aristotle had conceived the basic insights of what would come to be expressed mathematically by infinitesimal calculus. The words in which Aristotle came to conceive this subtle relation between indivisible unity and infinite multiplicity were dunamis, energeia, and entelikeia, two of which he himself had to create, since this reality had not been named. By carefully examining them, we will be able to reconstruct the subtle integral intuition of life which underlies Aristotelian metaphysics. This is far from a generally accepted interpretation, so much so that it is even somewhat commonly accepted that Aristotle had a contempt for the infinite and change, that he wanted to avoid them whenever possible, preferring limit, the finite, and the static, and seeing multiplicity as mere irrationality needing to be overcome in the universality of concepts. Thus, Aristotle is thought to have fled from the messy, ugly reality of matter and bodies in order to take refuge in the fantasy of a complete static knowledge, accessible by transparency of language, and embraced by an inflexible and all-encompassing theory. According to this interpretation, if he gave up the Platonic realm of forms, he only replaced it with an encyclopedic catalog of taxonomies put into general types. His relation to generality is complex, and as I will show, he in fact favored concrete individuality. Furthermore, he did not despise multiplicity, diversity, change, or infinite variation. Nor did he think motion for the same reason was unreal or unworthy of serious study, but approached it as if it was superlatively in need of being treated carefully. This way of taking motion seriously is emphatically expressed by Aristotle throughout the Physics. The subtle continuity of matter and form, which dynamically defines all concrete natural entities, was more or less the central thread of his whole philosophy. Aristotle used the same principles to explain physics, psychology, and epistemology, hylomorphism. The form is basically an integration of material multiplicity, in the sense that we would say that the vital activities of an animal preserve the integrity of its constitution. This integral individuality, as I will show, is not supported by a concept or vaulted in a transcendent system of ideas, but is an immanent form developing in time and which can only be found in sensible experience. The fact that Leibniz had stumbled upon the problems of the infinitely small in philosophical and metaphysical questions is attested to by the great philosopher Solomon Maimon. He wrote that these concepts in fact belonged to philosophy and were taken from there over into mathematics, as well as that of the great Leibniz came upon the discovery of the differential calculus through his system of the monadology. Leibniz encountered the need to posit a real concrete individuality which is not merely composed piecemeal by discrete units, or atoms, but rather forms a continuity by virtue of the generative idea, substance, that contains the infinite diversity of details in an indivisible whole. This was the mode of thinking of the philosophical or metaphysical conception of the infinitesimal thought that Leibniz ingeniously formulated mathematically. It is by following this thread of historical development that the importance of the metaphysical roots of infinitesimal thought connecting to Aristotle becomes obvious. Central to the whole conception of monadology is the rejection of atomism, not merely as a theory of physics, but as a general tendency. It involves an insufficient way of thinking. Leibniz tells us in the third section of his new system, after, quote, having freed himself from the bondage of Aristotle, end quote, he accepted the void and atoms. Though these abstract concepts merely satisfied his young imagination, and later on further reflection he found them wholly unsatisfactory to the standards of thought itself. The reason, he said, was that aggregates have no intrinsic principle of unity or individuality. The soul itself is the ultimate source of unity and individuality. Atomism will never be capable of providing a principle of individuation. Thus, Leibniz returned to Aristotle to retrieve a certain conception of substance as an original activity or primitive force, conceived in the dynamic sense of being. This provided him with not merely an alternative theory to atomism, but rather with an altogether different mode of thinking, which will come to be referred to by Bergson as infinitesimal thought. Entelechy is the integral which, like a curve, is the complete unity generating and holding together a continuity involving an infinite number of different infinitely small fluctuations and details. Thus, the entelechy, as a unique individual, is the principle which generates the unity of an infinite multiplicity. It is the very substance of the soul. These are the humble beginnings to the great mathematical contributions he would make by inventing a notion for calculus. It arose in part from a dynamic interpretation of Aristotle's theory of continuity and dynamic conception of activity. It is this infinitesimally conceived dynamism which is also indispensable to Bergsonism. This is a remarkable fact of intellectual history, especially given the relative lack of literature and conversation on the topic. What I show is that dynamics and infinitesimal thought are two sides of the same coin. But it seems that no one has attempted to reconstruct this history by placing themselves in it quite as explicitly as Henri Bergson, who went so far as to define his metaphysics as operating differentials and qualitative integrations, and attributed, quote, whatever living quality there is in metaphysics to this, quote, most powerful method of investigation known to the mind, infinitesimal calculus, end quote. His famous qualitative multiplicity is in fact analogous to the integral function generating a curve, and he uses infinitesimal thought to understand the most fundamental activities of memory and life. Bergson described intuition as an integral of experience, and defined pure memory as the integral of the past. In the history of the idea of thought, he reconstructs the history of infinitesimal thought in detail, tracing the many tributaries which he claims converged in the novel metaphysical conception of infinitesimal multiplicity and indivisible unity of duration by Bergsonism itself. Yet Bergson does not credit this history to Aristotle directly, but rather to Plotinus. He presents a reductive interpretation of Aristotelian motion, which renders it static, external, and relative, as translated into symbols in space. Thus, he reduces the Aristotelian ontology of change to static concepts, which, in a way, places Aristotle in the same camp as the atomism which he had rejected, since atomism can only be, hypothetically, incorporeal, unextended, and immovable elements which in fact cannot constitute the corporeal continuity, qualities, and movements. Aristotle rejected atomism by rejecting that the abstract can engender the concrete. Aristotle's theory of dynamics, thus, upholds that the dynamic continuity of natural bodies and movements, as given in sense experience, are fundamental and irreducible. The logical reductive reading is further complicated and able to be contended by examining the role Aristotle played in Bergson's early philosophical development. This is highlighted in his doctoral thesis, Quid Aristoteles de loco senserit? What is Aristotle's sense of place? Where we see Bergson clearly describe Aristotelian motion dynamically in terms of the internal reality of principles of movement and the intensity of self-initiated action. In Time and Free Will, written contemporaneously, we find Bergson defines his own position, a sort of neo-voluntarism, in terms of dynamics, and this way of describing his metaphysics will remain and indeed play an essential role all the way until his final works. A careful study of Bergson's many references to Aristotle shows a vacillating treatment, which at times is plainly inconsistent. There are enough comments, however, to show that he could not have merely interpreted Aristotle in a strictly logical way, but that he found a living quality in his metaphysics which relies on an intuition which goes beyond static concepts or intellectual analysis to coincide with reality in its dynamic sense. In an introduction to metaphysics, Bergson links infinitesimal thought to a reversal of the habitual way of thinking, which tends naturally towards analysis and relative knowledge. The inverse direction to the intellect places thought in concrete reality as an absolute, i.e., lived duration. In Creative Evolution and the History of the Idea of Time, Bergson attempted to deny any share of this inner reality to Aristotle, any intuition of reality in the making. And yet, this is what we will demonstrate to be at the heart of Aristotle's dynamic sense of being, a sensible intuition of concrete movement, the interiority of which is the integral, while its infinite variations, artificially decomposed and treated externally, are mere derivatives. Despite Bergson's attempts to evade Aristotelianism, he came close on a few occasions to admitting the connection. There is the above-mentioned comment in a footnote to two students' questions in the 1903 class, where he says that it is possible to, quote, to show, quote, by relying on the text of Simplicius, of Theophrastus, of Stobaeus, or even of Aristotle, how it is possible to find in the first Greek philosophers the elements of a theory of time, which would be the theory of a duration, of a reality given immediately as becoming. He directly admits that there is an encounter with durations and an immediate becoming in ancient Greek philosophy, but moves immediately to claim that they all simply dismissed the need to study this reality, having judged it to be too difficult, since the subject matter itself is inexpressible in clear representations. This parallels Bergson's claim in Creative Evolution that eidos, form, is a derivative concept formed by extracting a static translation of duration of the moment of becoming and evolution. When we move from the problems of our perception of movement and awareness of time, treated as subsections of a system of philosophical doctrines, to intuition itself as constituting the whole of philosophical activity, the reality of duration again appears to be Aristotelian. Bergson says intuition is like Aristotle's sense of form, in that it is a unity which includes a diversity of irreducibly different perspectives, and that it is something which is ultimately inexpressible in language. He says that Aristotle conceived of bodies more spiritually and mind more embodied than a modern like Descartes, which parallels Bergson's own infinitesimal hylomorphic spiritualism. He also tells us that we should study the ancients, become imbued with their spirit, and try to do what they themselves would be doing were they living among us, endowed with our knowledge, especially of biology and psychology. Such an inspiration, the reconstruction of which I have tried to make clear in what follows, cannot consist of an abstruse desire for a static, unchanging system of concepts, nor the dismissal of real duration, but instead must refer to a dynamic sense of being involving the intimate continuity of body and soul. We will examine these and other such moments where Bergson furtively or overtly shows his Aristotelian inspirations. How Bergson came close to admitting that Aristotle's philosophy involved intuitions is a story which is made more clear by the examination of the intermediary between Bergson and Aristotle, Félix Ravissant, a source of inspiration by means of which Bergsonism is seen to emerge from Aristotelianism, who filled the whole of metaphysics with a central tendency, which places us in the midst of reality and experience, and making an infinity of details converge in the intuition of concrete individuals. We find a paragon of the dynamic interpretation of Aristotle in the works of Ravissant. He even links spiritual energy and effort with integral unity, infinitesimal thought. Ravissant tells us that Aristotle had substituted the vague formulas of logical relations for the two elements enveloping movement, power and act. This substitution has major implications which get at the heart of the dynamic sense of being. Ravissant is that mobile middle term, which produces the initial thrust propelling the dynamic sense of being into unforeseeable novelty in Bergsonism. A close examination of this relation reveals the missing link in the evolution from Ravissant's Leibnizian Aristotelianism to Bergson's advance into novelty, a philosophy of mobile intermediaries rather than static substances. The gradual growth of virtue implies a progressive development through various stages in the process of learning and habituation involving effort. Effort is the mobile middle term, which raises the soul up through practice and self-improvement by integrating prior developments into new forms of activity. The substantial psychical effort activity is a living duration which intensifies itself rather than statically supporting logical predicates. This basic formula of Aristotelian ethics, understood dynamically, is that the right effort pays dividends to itself by growing, increasing, and developing its own energy. Energy is a kind of growing and intensifying which involves intentionality, awareness, motricity. Virtue is a sort of energetic way of skillfully bearing and navigating the situations of life. It is with the virtuality involved in the developmental temporality of spiritual energy, what Ravison calls a whole of subordinate parts interlinked by a sequence of continuous proportions, which unifies the continuity between Aristotelian dynamics and Bergsonism. Effort and spiritual or psychical energy are conceived in terms of tension and concentration, not statically as concepts, symbols, or quantities. Effort and energy are, in fact, only really describable in terms of qualitative multiplicity. Above all, Ravisson's contributes a clear interpretation of Aristotle's dynamic sense of being based on the critique of the logical interpretation. Not only does Aristotelian philosophy involve an effort and spiritual energy, its aim is the intuition of concretely individuated principles involving gradual transformations, intricate relations of interpenetrating dynamic parts unrolling through multiplicity. Just as infinitesimal calculus is a decisive step forward in its own right beyond the metaphysical precursors in Aristotle, so too is Bergson's qualitative multiplicity an advancement or evolution rather than a mere repetition of Aristotelian dynamics, but without reducing the precursor to a static or logical system. It is only by reference to new moral and scientific ideas that Bergson can be seen to surpass Aristotelianism. This was a reformulation, a radical one no doubt, but nevertheless one rooted in the dynamic and concrete character of Aristotelian conception of effort, energy, and individuality. Bergson developed Aristotelian philosophy further rather than abandoning it. Thus, the present work will examine, first, the inspiration from Ravisson's interpretation of Aristotle found across Bergson's philosophy and what they tell us about his interpretation of a theory of dynamics. 2. The way qualitative multiplicity is found to be able to be found in Aristotle's theory of dynamics. 3. The failure of Bergson to reduce Aristotelian to a system of concepts conceived on the base of presence to consciousness. I will conclude by indicating the way Bergson surpassed Aristotle in his description of open morality. The critique of presence to consciousness, the cinematographical mechanism. Bergson addressed the problem of presence to consciousness again and again throughout his whole philosophical career, starting most emphatically in Time and Free Will in relation to intensity as treated in psychology and physiology. Basically, presence is a form of spatializing and is derivative or extracted from qualitative durations in which the whole is never present all at once. In Matter and Memory, the problem is addressed directly, and his famous cone image is used as a solution to understand the problem of the practical character of intellectual knowledge as a tendency to abstract a static representational multiplicity from the flowing of continuous multiplicity. In short, the continuity of matter and memory cannot be reduced to a totalizing vision, taking all at once as present to consciousness. In Creative Evolution, this problem is explicated in relation to Bergson's critique of negation and substitution, which leads to his formulation of the cinematographical mechanism. Once the cinematographical mechanism is constructed, Bergson immediately uses it to critique the philosophy of Aristotle. His critique required smashing the detail and subtlety of Aristotle's dynamics into a simplistic method consisting in an analysis of the structure of language. His characterization denies Aristotle's evocative use of language and the living quality of his dynamic sense of being. Bergson claimed that Aristotle's philosophy is, at bottom, an analysis of language ending up with a symbolic and relative knowledge which falsely reconstitutes movement from static concepts. It fails to imitate life because it ends up relying on cinematographical mechanisms of mental representation. His syllogisms and definitions operate in the generality of predicable substances conceived externally by means of attaching a static quality to a generic subject. Language furnishes a static, homogeneous, and closed system of concepts which, by definition, will be incapable of expressing life, which is dynamic, heterogeneous, singular, and open, our conceptions of which must remain flexible and admittedly incomplete. Concepts aim at generality, fixity, and completeness. According to Bergson, Aristotle's analysis of language does not involve any critique of these imperfections of language. In Creative Evolution, Bergson's critique of the cause of the false problems as treated in Matter and Memory is made into an image, the cinematographical mechanism. This image characterizes the natural bend or tendency of the intellect to seek after fixed qualities, stable recognizable identities, and a homogeneous material substratum, that which can be manipulated, attenuated, or interrupted however one likes. In this way, the intellect cuts up the becoming of continuity that consists in an unpredictable progression so as to preside over circumstances with actions achieving predictable results. Intellect, like the attention to life, substitutes concrete duration for static abstractions. This natural tendency of thought and life are disposed to operate like a motion picture camera, which has, from the start, completely eliminated motion by capturing still pictures, but seeks to reintroduce it by rapidly flashing the images in succession. This mechanism tricks us into seeing motion where there is none. The mechanism of a projector is analogous to the abstract idea of becoming in general. The general concept makes becoming unintelligible, since it is no longer the becoming of any concrete reality. Becoming itself is treated as a static concept which can be appended to static realities to concoct mobility artificially. In just the same way, Zeno's paradoxes also destroy the real continuity of motion. They show how the intellect, cutting, dividing, analyzing, decomposing, and fixing, fails to conceive of a true passage to the limit, which traverses an infinite number of potential parts. With this critique of common sense as habitually intellectual, Bergson sought to characterize Aristotle as an analyzer of static linguistic relations that substitute real becoming. In fact, Aristotle's response to Zeno, as we will see, is very close to Bergson's. Nevertheless, this is at the heart of the critique of Greek philosophy presented by Bergson. It operated on a threefold sense of eidos, which corresponds directly to the three parts of language. In this way, eidos is made out to be something merely static and derivative. Quote, it denotes 1. The quality, 2. The form or essence, 3. The end of design, in the sense of intention, of the act being performed. That is to say, at bottom, the design, in the sense of drawing, of the act supposed accomplished. These three aspects are those of the adjective, substantive, and verb, and correspond to the three essential categories of language. The eidos is the stable view taken of the instability of things. The essential feature of the philosophy of ideas is its tendency towards stability, homogeneity, and abstraction. It cannot be overstressed how strong of a critique this is for Bergson to make. His usual targets are Descartes, Kant, Spencer, and in general, the intellectualist and mechanistic reductionisms which has pervaded modernity. Nevertheless, Bergson makes it clear that he believed this paradigm had its roots in the philosophy of ideas. Quote, an irresistible attraction brings the intellect back to its natural movement, and the metaphysics of the moderns to the general conclusions of Greek metaphysics. This attraction is an unconscious tendency, inherent to the habits of thought turned towards action, drawing the spiritual energy of the élan vital into the entropic somnolence of immovable logic and universal mathematics. Thus, the great effort of Bergsonian intuition turns against entropic tendency towards homogeneity in order to initiate a revolutionary adaptation of creative intelligence, dynamically integrating multiplicity. It is by tearing away from language that we do metaphysics, even if we require a return to language as philosophers who write books and give talks. Bergson makes intuition a method for metaphysics precisely by seeking what exceeds language, that is, real movement and duration. In Bergson's image of ancient thought, the, quote, mold of language acts as a camera shutter, capturing the flow of duration and reducing it to unchanging, abstract, conventional symbols. In the cinematographic image of thought, the mind seeks to fix the changing, and truth is granted only to an immobile, unchanging essence. The mind itself is not itself composed of anything abstract or immobile. Quote, the cinematographical character of our knowledge of things is due to the kaleidoscopic character of our adaptation to them. Thus, Bergson seeks to reverse and dissolve metaphysical problems by appealing to the original kaleidoscopic adaptations of duration, from which discrete instances, regions of space, or determinate concepts are produced by an abstraction, diminution, or negation. The kaleidoscopic character of the intellect expresses the living habituation of thought as a process of forming ideas by decomposition and recompositions in duration. The reason he uses a kaleidoscope to describe this kind of duration is that with each turn of the kaleidoscope, the image changes as a whole, as it does in lived duration. Quote, there is, between our body and other bodies, an arrangement like that of a piece of glass that compose a kaleidoscopic picture. Our activity goes from an arrangement to a rearrangement, and each time, no doubt, giving the kaleidoscope a new shake, but not interesting itself in the shake and seeing only the new picture. Becoming an evolution as real duration involve changes to the whole, but our attention to life is unconcerned with the nature of this continuous qualitative multiplicity. Practical attention is locked on the signs it can fix and use to predict advantageous lines of actions. The forms of Greek philosophy are thus no different than the signs that we use in practical action. It is by a derivation that the moment of becoming, evolution, and alteration are replaced by quality, form, and essence. This static conception is consummated by the analysis of the structure of language into adjectives, substantives, and verbs. Bergson levels two additional critiques on Aristotle and creative evolution. First, that his conception of matter is a kind of metaphysical zero, or a negation added to a positive. This interpretation mixes Neoplatonism, degrees of reality, and Kant's doctrine on intensive magnitude. Bergson suggests that Aristotelian matter is a sort of intensity equals zero, as Kant put it, which is to say, a complete negation of reality. Now, for Kant, this negation of reality is what shows the form of intuition to be separable from the manifold of sensation, i.e., infinite empty space. This conception of matter as absolute negation is in fact utterly un-Aristotelian, something which Bergson himself admits, and we will examine below. For Aristotle, to be means to exist in potency or actuality, both of which involve a positive degree of reality. Aristotle's hule is a causal ingredient in concrete reality. Secondly, Bergson claims that although Aristotle tried to bring forms down to earth, i.e., treat them as immanent forms of processes, but he ultimately failed because he ends up just rolling all of the forms up into a ball and placing them above the universe in a pure actuality as an immovable divine intellect. He then goes on to claim that Aristotle's philosophy is basically an attempt to arbitrarily and abstractly reconnect supersensible ideas to an infrasensible non-being. Sensible being and motion are simply the diminution of the immutable by a sudden addition of a negation, which makes concrete forms imperfect imitations, unrolling in time. This accusation is much more difficult to deal with and will require us to cover far more references to Aristotle's text to be able to adequately answer it. The simple answer is that Aristotle did not think that he needed to add concepts together to understand the dynamic hylomorphism of nature and soul. Nor did he think that forms can be reduced to static concepts, nor matter to an abstraction like negation. These two additional critiques are based on the first and reply to the assumption that Aristotle proceeded cinematographically towards generality, when in fact he proceeded on the basis of experience to arrive in dynamics. The problems of philosophical language. Against the cinematographical mechanism, including all efforts at systematic symbolic translation of reality into concepts and relations, Bergson proposes another method which he called philosophical intuition. His method of intuition is dedicated to the preservation of the integrity of qualitative multiplicity and proceeds by turning our attention to the kaleidoscopic nature of change. The method is based on the conviction that the concrete reality of duration is repugnant to being expressed in language, which renders it in a mode of presence to consciousness. Bergsonism involves a sort of oath taken by the philosopher to do no harm to the integrity of life and look everywhere to uncover the pernicious acts of substitution and replacement which misinterpret life's true nature, i.e., as continuous. The implicit affirmation of this philosophy of intuition is that existence is not equivalent to presence to consciousness, nor time to the present. The symbol, so to speak, of Bergsonism is, of course, the famous cone. In Matter and Memory, the body itself is a sign. Images are liberated from their stasis and their confusion with a mere derivative representational presence to consciousness, dissipated. Signs, images, and language itself in poetic evocation can come to life for Bergson, and so we must not understand his critique of them in a limited sense as simply bad or unreal. His criticism consists of the fact that when we use signs, symbols, concepts, or language, we tend to become absorbed in the way they operate in a system of actions, meanings, manipulations of matter, or practical expectations. Absorbed in living them, in the attention to life, their derivative nature is ignored. We fail to notice the reduction to presence to consciousness, and the fact of substitution is considered inconsequential, since it serves no practical use. Only speculative philosophy, by philosophical intuition, detached from the soul's absorption in the attention to life, can we obtain an integral view of life in the fullness of its ineffable qualitative multiplicity. The cone image, laid out in geometrical space, in fact, discloses the limits of presence to consciousness, symbolism, and the cinematographical mechanism of thought. The image has no truth on its own, but must be experienced by an effort of self-reflection, an experimental auto-memoir. The continuity of experience is strung between body and soul, becoming and being, sensory motor activity, and virtual memory. Irreversible passage and the impassable past. This unity of opposites in duration is reflected in the cone as well. A point and a circle are two incommensurable geometrical entities. One is unextended and indivisible, the other continuous and divisible. Taken as discrete concepts present to consciousness, we can no longer find a way they could be parts of a continuous whole. The gradual convergence of a cone concretely unites these antithetical concepts. The base of the cone, representing the pure and integral past, forms an indivisible bond with the point, while the point signifies the perpetual becoming of the body in the present. Consciousness is, according to this model, a conic section which involves the continuity of matter and memory at a unique degree of tension. Consciousness concretely combines an infinitely detailed past and the becoming of the present. The truth of this continuity is apparent to one who lives it for themselves, not as a proposition connecting an attribute to a subject. The subjective unity of experience involves multiplicity, and so strict logic has always failed to contain it in totality. Thus, presence to consciousness discards the depth of continuity and takes what is only a mere limit, like mere plane interposed in the continuous solid shape of a cone. Existence can be reduced to the presentation selected and fixed by consciousness, but must be considered as an integrative part exceeding both presence to consciousness and the present in time. Bergson uses this image and, in an introduction to metaphysics, a whole series of images to describe duration. This does not imply that he is reducing duration to an image or to a static concept. The use of language by the philosopher who has insisted that language is unable to express reality is no doubt strange and comes off almost self-contradictory. Bergson takes this problem very seriously and does his utmost to give a satisfactory answer. His answer is complex and will be explainable only in the due progress of this study, but put in a cursory way, it is by using suggestive rather than expressive language. Language must be evocative rather than simply propositional. Such poetic use of language relies on sympathy which, quote, places before the eyes, as Aristotle said. The activity which is lively, vivid, forceful, mobile, and above all, dynamic. What this use of language does, in the end, is suggest a possible movement which a listener must undertake by their own initiative, and it is by the givenness of their own interactivity as spiritual energy that the absolute evidence of concrete duration has its truth. For Aristotle, the composite unity of matter and form implies that the concrete individual is not reducible to its present condition at a single instant or atemporally, but instead exists both actually and potentially, together as enduring in time. Potency involves change, and change occurs gradually in a continuous variation. The immanent living form of animals are not snapshots or average conditions, but the actual infinitely variable condition of an enduring entity developing through irreversible processes and containing its own principles of activity in itself potentially. The relevant principles are physis, psyche, and nous, none of which is reducible to a concept, presence to consciousness, or an eternal present. The living form of human life, as we will see, is temporalized in at least 5 irreducible ways. Bergson's interpretation of Aristotle, which renders philosophy as a mere analysis of static linguistic structures, will be found again and again to fail upon further scrutiny. Thus, we will see that there are a number of ways in which Aristotle stated problems temporally, that they are all in fact essential to understanding his philosophy. He described a kaleidoscopic transformation in the continuity of matter and form. He investigated the activity of nous, which is irreducible to presence to consciousness or language, but whose activity reveals time and motion in sensible intuitions. He restates problems of like and unlike, eating, perceiving, learning, developmentally in terms of temporality. He described the nature of living form as a dynamic relation between dunamis and energeia and entelikeia. Even in his understanding of ousia, involving physis and psyche, his aim is a concrete this, which is an individual developing gradually over time and passing through an infinite number of transformations, following inner principles. Finally, his own inventiveness, which led him to coin many terms and phrases, above all energeia and entelikeia, involve an evocative use of language which is meant to foster an intuitive grasp of the dynamic sense of being by means of an autofection of effort. We will attempt to place ourselves in the effort and energy which Aristotle's dynamic sense of being requires and restore to it its living quality.